Hello and welcome to the G5 Hive and our next installment of our Worker Bee series, where we deep dive into the G5 college football landscape with the folks that know the teams the best. Today we're taking a look at North Texas Mean Green, who finished 5-7 in the American Athletic Conference, but ended on a high note, winning their final two games under first-year head coach Eric Morris. They wrapped up their 2024 spring practice with their spring game on April 6th. We have a special guest joining us today. Please welcome to the show, Vito.
Yeah, it's Vito. Thanks for having me, guys.
Vito. All right. Well, Brett, you are a North Texas beat writer for the Denton Record Chronicle. Can be found on Twitter, X, whatever people are calling it nowadays, at Brett. Vito, a 21-time Associated Press Sports Editors Top 10 honoree and a 2021 and 2018 Class A Texas Sports Writer of the Year. Congratulations on those honors.
Oh, yeah, thanks, guys.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into sports reporting and covering North Texas.
Well, it was something I always wanted to do. I grew up in the Denver area and, just really liked sports. And not only that, but I really loved the newspaper business. Grew up reading the Denver Post and, kind of that was what I wanted to do. And then I had some contacts. There was a guy that went to the church I went to when I was a kid that was a sports writer. And, that was kind of always what I wanted to do. Then I went to school in Missouri, got out of school in Missouri, and then ended up coming down to Texas for a job. And then bounced around in a couple different papers, like a lot of guys do. And then I got here. I always wanted to cover D1. And then I just ended up staying. And I've been here for a really, really long time, kind of know where all the bodies are buried. And, I had some other opportunities to maybe chase some other jobs over the years, to go cover, bigger schools up or, schools higher up the food chain, but I just kind of decided to stick around. And, it's been a pretty enjoyable deal. It's kind of a sweet spot, because these are the programs at at the American Athletic Conference level where, you can really get in and, really get a chance to talk to the athletes and, get some really cool stories and things like that without just the massive pressure of the sports reporting business and things like that. It's just kind of an enjoyable level spot to be in.
Good stuff. So moving on to the football side of things, North Texas lost a lot of returning production from an offense that was really rolling last season. They ranked 6th in total offense, averaging just under 500 yards a game, 12th in passing, just over 300 yards per game, and 22nd in rushing offense, almost 200 yards a game. And then they put up a lot of points too, ranking 20th, 34.5 points per game. So, last year that he really had the offense going there in year one, but they're going to have to replace some of those pieces from last year. So we're going to take a look at the position, kind of where it all starts, and that is quarterback for the offense, and probably one of the biggest question marks, I guess, going into the spring. You've written about it numerous times in several articles. They lost last year's starter, Chandler Rogers, to California. Stone Earl entered the transfer portal, but they were able to talk him back into returning. And they have a commitment from former TCU quarterback Chandler Morris, but he will not arrive until the summer. We were talking a little bit before the show, the general consensus is folks feel like that aren't necessarily know as much about North Texas as you. The general consensus, I think, is that this is Chandler Morris's job to lose. Do you feel that same way, or you think it's going to be, he's really going to have to push hard and win the job?
Well, I think it's going to be a competitive deal. Coach Morris was talking about how Stone has grown and developed over the course of his time at North Texas. And then he's, a very knowledgeable guy in terms of the system and things like that. And so it'll be a battle going into the summer. I just don't, when it comes down to it, I think you're going to end up seeing Chandler Morris end up being the guy here. This guy was a high-end recruit at Highland Park, went to Oklahoma, transferred to TCU, put up over 2,400 passing yards at TCU. And really the thing that did him in at TCU was just being injured all the time. It wasn't like he just flat out was terrible and lost the job to somebody else. I mean, he won that job twice.
He won it twice, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty impressive. You guy that's won it twice at TCU. I really like Stone as a guy, and I think he's a good player. But I mean, this guy was a guy that went to an FCS school out of high school, and didn't win it. Ended up keeping. He had some injury problems at ACU as well, but ended up not hanging on to the job at ACU. And then he comes over here, and he ended up winning the starting job going into last year, but only held on to it for about a game and a half, and then Chandler Rogers took over and ended up having a monster year that landed him on the radar for some of these Power 5 programs that were looking for a quarterback. So he ends up going into the portal and lands at Cal, and that was one of the schools that was recruiting him when he went to North Texas. He's one of those quarterbacks that's bounced around a lot. He started out at Southern Miss, and then he went to JUCO, and then he went to Louisiana Monroe, put up big numbers in Monroe, and then that's a program that kind of hangs on by its fingernails in terms of being a Division I program. Doesn't have a lot to work with. Went back into the portal, and then he was being recruited by Cal and North Texas and a bunch of other places. He ends up deciding to come here, and has a monster year. Now he's back in the portal and on to Cal. So but I mean, that's a guy. So I think what's going to end up happening is probably what ends up happening last year. I think Stone will put up a good fight, but I think in the end, you're going to see Chandler Morris out there for the majority of the season.
You had written an article about this, but maybe you can share with the listeners that probably haven't had the chance to read it. What was the reasoning behind Chandler not being able to, or not wanting to enroll in January, not coming till the summer?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. A lot of people have asked about that, and we have written about it, and we talked to him when he committed. And the thing is, he was at Oklahoma, and then he was at TCU, and he's gotten to the point where he was just a couple of classes short of getting his degree. So he decided to stay at TCU for a couple extra months for the summer semester, or not the summer, for the spring semester, so he could finish out his degree. He's pretty much habitually at practice, though. College athletes these days, it's not like they're in class 24/7. They have especially later in your college career for these athletes, they may be in an online class or maybe having to go to a class or two here or there, but most of their time is pretty free. So he's come up here for practice quite a bit. He's always hanging around and things like that. So he ended up staying at TCU to get his degree, and then he'll be up here in the summer to kind of quickly adapt and get ready for the year.
That's great to hear. We were talking earlier too. There's always the rumor mill that, hey, is he going to change his mind? Any thoughts on that? I mean, it sounds like no, right? He's coming to practice. Sounds like he's pretty committed, but
yeah, I mean, it sure seems that way. But because I mean, at this point, there's nothing binding him, right? I mean, he could change his mind tomorrow and show up at Texas State to play for his dad, because there's nothing binding him, because he signed with Oklahoma and then he transferred to TCU. So with the freedom of movement for players, it's not like he signed another binding letter of intent.
He's not enrolled or
he just decide. The thing that kind of quelled some of that a little bit was the fact that Texas State got a pretty big time quarterback transfer of their own in there to play for his dad. So, but if something happened to that guy blew out his ACL or something like that in spring practice, I mean, all those rumors would come back. But to me, and I just talked to somebody the other day, and they were like, oh, they were talking about how he's going to be here soon and that kind of stuff. I just think it's gonna work out to where Morris is going to end up being the guy here for this season.
What do you think? How do you think the staff was able to go about convincing Stone Earl to come back and not move on elsewhere?
Well, I mean, we talked to him about it, right, and we talked to Coach about it and things like that. And the thought process was they went to Stone after Chandler left and said, "Hey, look, you're here, the system, you've already won the job once." Granted, we eventually went to Chandler Rogers, but you've won the job once here. You're highly respected. You're a team captain. Why why go back to ACU when you can stay here and you have a chance to win the job? here where you're already pretty comfortable instead of changing schools again at this point. So they were able to convince him to come back. And, and in hindsight, you kind of wonder, I'm sure he wasn't going to change his mind, but you wonder if he knew at that point when they were trying to talk him into coming back and did talk him into coming back, if he knew that there was going to be another transfer that's going to come in right behind him. I mean, I'm sure they told him, hey, we're still going to look for another option because we got to have another quarterback on the roster. But if he knew at that point that there was going to be a guy that started, threw for 2,400 yards in the Big 12, would he have stuck with that decision to come back? I mean, you're never going to get a straight answer on that. But if you had to shoot him up with truth serum, I kind of wonder, would he have made that same decision instead of going back to ACU? We'll never know, but that was kind of the way it played out.
Talking about some of the younger faces in that room, and they brought in Liberty transfer Reese Mooney. They had true freshman early enrollee Cash McCollum. How did those guys look in the spring?
That was one of the interesting things that happened, like particularly in the spring game. Because you have Stone was definitively the best guy, but of those two, Cash McCollum really stepped forward and showed some pretty big potential. Coach Moritz compared him to Seth Hennigan, the Memphis quarterback, which is interesting because Seth played at Denton Ryan here in town before the previous staff slow played him on and off, and then he ended up at Memphis, and then he blew up at Memphis. So, it was an interesting comparison to hear Coach compare Cash to Seth Hennigan. And there's, I can see what he's saying because Cash is not like your super athlete kind of guy, but he's a coach's son, just like Seth was. And he went out there in the spring game and really threw the ball well, had a couple of touchdown passes. And I think he's kind of, at this point, it sure as heck looks on paper like this is your long-term kind of guy. Now, granted, they'll take a quarterback in the next cycle. So, if they get some kind of superstar kind of guy in there, that could change the dynamic of everything. But the way it sits now, it certainly looks like, you've got the two older guys. You've got Stone, who's a senior. You got Chandler, who's going to be a junior. And then you got the redshirt freshman and the freshman. And then you'll bring in another guy this next cycle. But with the lay of the land now, it certainly looks like if everything plays out the way it looks like it will, it'll be okay. You've got Stone, the part stage left after this season, and you've got Chandler for this season and next season, and then the next guy in line would be Cash.
Yeah, it's interesting to talk about those things, especially in today's world, right? Because it could all change tomorrow. But yeah, that's definitely encouraging and positive news to hear for sure.
Oh yeah, that's the crazy thing is I talked to their quarterback coach Sean Brophy here over the course of spring, and that was one thing that he was kind of happy about because over the last few years, they developed. They hadn't really developed over the long term a high school quarterback that kind of went through the whole growth process thing. Mason Fine they threw him in there in his freshman year, and he played 4 years. And then after he left, they had a whole bunch of transfers, guys. They went through the whole transfer process of trying to find a guy and hit on a guy. The last guy that really they took and developed over the long term that really, really worked out was Derek Thompson, who led them to the Heart of Dallas Bowl win in 2013. He was a guy that came in as a freshman and redshirted, and he got hurt at one point. But the thing is he kind of was there for the long term and developed over a course of years. And so now they've kind of got the potential with some of these young guys and having a couple of older guys that they feel good about that they can play. Okay, we can play these guys and we can develop a guy long term.
All right. Now moving on to the running game, and another question mark for this offense. They lose their top 4 rushers from a year ago in Ayo Adeyi, off to JMU, Oscar Attaway III, off to South Carolina, Isaiah Johnson, off to Albany Christian, and the aforementioned Chandler Rogers. But not all hope is lost. They do bring in transfer Zach Evans, I think on Twitter or X, the real Zach Evans, coming in from Minnesota. They got Trade Bradford from LSU, and then Ragsdale returns. How did that running back room look this spring?
Well, that's the thing. We didn't see over these guys. I mean, Akaika missed the entire spring due to injury. He got hurt really bad. He got a nasty injury last year. That's why he only played 2 games, right? So he only plays the 2 games last year before he goes down for the year. But Akaika's got some skins on the wall here. I mean, he's rushed for 1,300 yards in his career and 12 touchdowns. He had a really good year in 2022 when he ran for 755 and 7. And they did bring in the 2 transfers, but those guys didn't see a whole heck of a lot of time just because they were hurt for a big chunk of spring practice. So, I mean, you head into the fall, you've got guys that makes sense, though. I think you can have a lot of faith in Akaika if he gets back to where he's healthy. And then Zach Evans is a guy that looks like he'll be a pretty impactful player for him. I mean, that was a guy that was that won the I think it was the Freshman of the Week honor in the Big Ten 1 week up there before he transferred back from Minnesota. So, he's a guy that is a good player, and they have a lot of hope in. And the thing is Patrick Cobbs has been the running backs coach there forever, and he always has a good room of guys. I mean, he's the Hall of Famer here, played in the NFL. It just kind of bleeds green, kind of a career North Texas guy. And every year he seems to have 2, 3, 4 guys that he can roll out there. I mean, as far as concerns for North Texas goes, I think the running backs room with Patrick running that thing is way down the list, even though they had some injury problems this year or this spring anyway.
So do you think that it's a kind of a 2-man rotation ish with Ragsdale and Evans, or still, like you said, not a lot has been seen yet, so we don't really know how that's going to play out?
Well, I mean, you just look at Patrick's history with that room. I mean, he plays a lot of guys. I mean, that's always been the case. So I would expect Ragsdale, Evans, Trey Bradford. I mean, I expect all those guys to get carries. They've got a good freshman in. I mean, I don't think he'll pull. They'll probably redshirt him anyway. But there's some good running backs in that room that I think that'll do. But those are the guys that I would expect. Quaylon Farr, he's been around for a little while. The Kiefer Sibley guy, he's a freshman from Waco Conley. He may have a good future, but I think he's a down the line guy. There was some thought that Mackenzie McGill, a former walk-on, I doubt he really makes an impact, but he did some good things in the spring. So, I mean, those are the guys you're going to see.
Week 1, who's lining up in the backfield as the week 1 starter? Not saying they might not come out after play number 2, but
I would assume Akaika.
Okay.
I mean, if he's healthy, I would, I think you roll with your, especially since those other guys didn't play a lot in the spring too. I would assume with the amount of skins Akaika's got on the wall and the fact they trust that guy, and the other guys are kind of new and transfers. I'm assuming you're going to see Akaika out there, unless the Zach Evans guy really tears it up in fall practice. But I would expect them to if they go with the first guy out there, I would assume would be Akaika.
Moving on to the wide receiver room in 2023, Jamori Macklin broke out in a big way. 57 receptions for 1,004 yards and 11 touchdowns, but sadly he decided to move on to Kentucky. Additionally, Roderick Burns graduated. Trey Cleveland moved on to Abilene Christian, but they do have some quality returners. They have Damon Ward, Landon Sides, Blair Conwright, Jordan Smart, and then they brought in transfer DT Sheffield, who I believe was recruited by Eric Morris to Washington State and has now followed him to North Texas. How did that wide receiver room look this spring?
Well, it's kind of the same thing with the as with the running backs. Jeremiah Aaron from West Virginia is another guy in there, and Dalton Carnes from Houston. So, but a lot of those guys were hurt all spring. We didn't see any of we didn't see anything of Landon. Landon was out the whole spring. Jeremiah Aaron, he looked good in practice in the first couple of weeks. He got hurt. He was out the rest of the spring. So. Some of these other guys, look pretty good. I mean, DT Sheffield was a guy that Coach Morris recruited when he was at Washington State. I think he'll contribute. Blair Conwright, he came over from TCU and is just a well-respected guy within the program. After a year, they trot him out there quite a bit in terms of talking to the media. And Mason Ferguson was an early enrollee that I think is going to show up this fall. He was committed to Louisiana Tech, a DFW guy that was committed to Louisiana Tech, and he flipped to North Texas. That was a big flip for North Texas because that guy showed up in spring practice and kind of like the quarterback, kind of like Cash did. He just immediately looked at home. He looked like he fit as a guy that should be in class, at his high school. It's the same way with Tyler Mercer, the offensive lineman. They flipped from Tulane at the very, very last minute. He was another mid-year enrollee that looked really good. So I think Mason Ferguson will be another guy you see out there. And that's the big question. I think that, do you have the one guy that can take the place of your leading receiver that was a really good player and put up a bunch of huge numbers? I mean, do you have that lead dog like you did last year? And I think that remains to be seen. I think the first guy up, though, is definitely going to be Damon Ward. I think he's done a lot over the course of his career and has the trust of the staff and the rest and the quarterbacks in that room. But do they have somebody that can put up the kind of numbers Jamori did? I mean, Jamori had 1,000 yards and 11 touchdowns last year. I mean, I don't know if they're going to have that one lead guy like they did last year, maybe more by committee, but we'll see. I mean, maybe one of these guys will come out of nowhere, just like he did last year. I mean, nobody was expecting Jamori to put up monster numbers, although he did have an impressive pedigree. So, I mean, we'll see this fall. Maybe one of these guys manages that.
If you had to predict who the three starters are, what would be your prediction?
Well, with the offense that they run, I mean, right now it looks like it'd be Damon, Blair, probably Jeremiah Aaron and Landon would be the four guys. Was what I've got on my projected depth chart for next year.
There's one guy who's not there yet, but I've seen some things about him. He seems pretty exciting. Looks like he'd fit really well in Eric Morris offense. I was wondering what you could tell us about Miles Coleman.
Yeah, he's probably one of the more interesting prospects they signed this last year because the guy is just blazing fast, but he's just incredibly short. Like he's like 5'5". He's just a tiny guy, and see if you're a guy like that, I mean not tiny, he's just short, right? Yeah. But if you're a guy like that, you need to find a home where you fit in a specific offense. And this is the offense that can fit a guy that's 5'5", right? So, I mean, he'll come in the fall, and it's just, can he translate that speed into being an immediate impact player as far as coming in as a slot guy, so he'd be one of those guys you're looking at in that kind of role. And it'd be, we'll see. I mean, some of those guys, receivers, a place where you can walk in day one. And, if you can learn the offense and things like that, you can make an immediate impact. So we may see him. You never know.
All right. Much like the rest of the offensive line lost some production as well with Casey Morka and is it Deonze Carroll graduating?
Oh, Dazion, yeah, he graduated last year. He was a pretty key member of their offensive line for years, and then he just kind of he was a backup in his last year after having some injury problems. But they did lose him. Yeah, he's gone after this year.
And then we got some transfers in Ethan Miner and then Fobechi Nuwa'u.
Nuawu, Fabechi, yeah,
Nuawu.
Fabechi went to Oklahoma. So
So
those are two pretty big losses. That's where a lot of their run game production came from. And one of the interesting things about the way that all played out was they tried to move Fabechi to tackle last year. You know, they tried it in spring practice. They're like, okay, this guy's terrific. We're going to move him out to tackle. And he looked like he was, you know, he could handle the job. But man, they moved Fabechi out of there. Like the first 2 games of the year, their running game was terrible. You know, it was just awful. And they moved, and so they decided, well, this isn't working. You know, they moved Fabechi back to guard, and then all of a sudden they're running for 200 plus yards a game again. So that was just like, that was one of those weird decisions that you look back and you're like, why did they do that? Because he was so great at guard, and once they moved him back in there, right next to Minor, you know, you've got. You think about it, that was really where their run game was. One of the big reasons their run game was so effective. I mean, you have a guy sitting there in Minor who was an SEC quality player. At least, you know, Mississippi State thought he was an SEC quality player. They picked him up as a transfer into Nuawu. Once he goes to Oklahoma, you know, so you had 2 guys that were Power 5 level, SEC level offensive linemen right next to each other in the middle of that offensive line. And once they put them back together in the middle like that, their running game was just immensely better.
but their pass protection not so great, as they ranked 113th in terms of allowing sacks, giving up 3.17 a game. How did the Mean Green shore up that offensive line, and how'd they look this spring?
Well, I thought the group looked pretty good. I mean, they brought in a couple of pretty key transfers, and that was the thing. Mekhi Lee, just a monstrous tackle, like a 350-pound guy. Like he was one of the better junior college offensive linemen in the country, and then he ends up going to Missouri, and he just sat the bench up there and didn't really play at all. Well, they picked him up out of the portal, and they also picked up Landon Peterson, who was an offensive lineman at Texas Tech, who did start some games up there and showed a lot, but ended up kind of falling down the depth chart. Well, all of a sudden you look at the depth chart there, those guys are both there. So, you're looking at Mekhi Lee. Gabe Blair was a terrific offensive lineman for them, has been for a long time. He'll be back. They're looking at they moved Jet Duncan, played tackle for them for quite a while. He's played pretty much everywhere. He's played guard, he's played tackle. They're moving him to center. So he moves inside the center, and then you got Landon at guard. And then the other question is, what do you do at right tackle? They brought in Jasper Watt, who was a converted tight end. He was actually from town here. Well, not actually from town, but he's from Argyle, like the next town over. And he's the son of a very famous NFL strength and conditioning coach who just recently retired. And they have a Texas Tech transfer that was here beginning last year named Larry Moore. So those 2 guys are sitting there at right tackle. And it's just going to be a matter of how these guys come together, because you do have a lot of new pieces out there. I mean, if the depth chart holds up, I mean, the only guy that's going to be back in the same place he was last year, if they start this way, would be Gabe Blair. So it's pretty much a reconstituted group. It did look pretty good in the spring, but we're just going to have to see how it meshes together once they get out there on Saturdays.
In a recent article, you mentioned a new tight end for the Mean Green that kind of had an impact in the spring, and in particular spring game. Last season, the tight end wasn't really utilized much in the passing game. With this addition, what you saw in the spring, tell us about the kid and what do you expect for him to, his production to kind of look like in 2024?
Well, I mean, that's a big question. The guy we're discussing here is Oscar Hammond. They didn't really get much production out of the tight end position last year, as they kind of transitioned to, a different look on offense and that kind of thing. They wanted to get somebody in there that would maybe help them out of that position. And they went and grabbed Oscar out of the transfer portal from a Division II school up in Oklahoma, where he was like a second or third team, but he was like second or third team all Lone Star Conference up there at Central Oklahoma. And they grabbed him, and he came down here, and he just had a terrific spring. You know, he was all over the place, made a lot of good catches down the field, showed the ability to, you know, to be an impact weapon offensively. And I would, you know, I'm assuming that he's going to start. Now, how much they use the tight end, you know, kind of remains to be seen. But I think this is a coach and a coaching staff that'll adjust to their talent. And this guy looks like he can be a bit more of a weapon than they had there in the past. So that developments in the spring. He did have a touchdown catch in the spring. Yeah, I think if this is just off memory here, but I think he had like 4 catches for 60 yards and a touchdown in the spring.
Yeah, I think that's what your article said. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, you know, so this guy all of a sudden looks like he could potentially be another piece of the puzzle there offensively, which I think would help them. You know, the more in this kind of offense, when you're running four wide receivers out there, the more guys that you have and you're throwing it all the time, the more guys you have that can pose a threat, I think the better off you are. And he's just another guy. He just adds another dimension to what they've got.
So if you had to pick an offensive player to have a breakout type season in 2024, would you pick for that to be?
A breakout season? I mean, the obvious pick would be Chandler Morris, but that's kind of a no-brainer with the spread system, right? What you're more looking at is like who's going to be your skill position guy that kind of comes through. I think Landon Sides would be a good pick just because, you know, he was a freshman last year that they threw out there. He showed that he could play right away, and he put up some pretty good numbers. And Landon had 30 catches for 363 yards and 4 touchdowns, which, you know, isn't a huge number, but I think his production will definitely go up. If you're looking for somebody to come out of nowhere, I would assume it'd be Jeremiah Aaron, the transfer they brought in from West Virginia, because he had a really good beginning part of the spring before he got hurt and then kind of vanished. But I would assume that, you know, I mean, if he moves into that starting X spot, you know, he might be the kind of guy that could have some pretty big numbers there.
All right. Moving over to the defensive side of the ball, which kind of was their Achilles heel in 2023. They ranked dead last in the FBS in terms of total yards allowed, giving up 476.4 yards per game, 118th in sacks, only getting 1.5 per game. What did the Mean Green do to this in the offseason to try to shore up this defense and you know, make some improvements for 2024?
I mean, that was arguably the big story of the whole deal last year. I mean, just the logistics of it didn't set up well for North Texas. If you think about it, last year the year before Coach got here, you know, they were under Phil Bennett, and who's arguably one of the best defensive coordinators in college football the last 30 years. And the guy was everywhere, LSU, Kansas State, you know, that kind of thing. And they ran that kind of 4-3 scheme. And then they go, you know, Morris decides, okay, well, the defense that's always given me the most problems is the 3-3-5. I want to run that as a defense. And then he hired Matt Capone, who was the cornerbacks coach at Iowa State, to come in and be the defensive coordinator. So essentially you're going from one of the most experienced defensive coordinators running in the country, one of the great ones of the era, running this specific system. And the only reason they were able to get Phil Bennett, they got him out of retirement, is because he's really close with Seth Luttrell. Like they were, you know, Bennett was one of his mentors because they go all the way back to when Seth's playing days at Oklahoma. Well, all of a sudden, okay, so he's gone. And now you decide you're going to hire in a guy who's a first-time defensive coordinator running a completely new scheme with players that you didn't recruit to play that scheme. So the whole thing was set up to be a disaster from the start. And that's kind of what happened. You know, the whole year, you know, they talked about, you know, we just don't really have the players to fit this system. We need to, you know, to really do some recruiting and revamping of the whole thing. Now you can go back and question, okay, well, if you didn't have the players to play that system, why do you sit there and shove the square peg into the round hole the whole freaking year and not at least make some, you know, do something a little different? And they did do a little bit of adjusting. Like they had one guy last year who was just an absolute monster in Bennett's system, who was like really, I mean, he was very clearly a 4-3 defensive end, and they moved him into the 3-3-5, and his production just absolutely plummeted.
Is that Richards?
Yeah, Mason. Yeah, Mason had that monster season.
Yeah.
And Mason ends up in 2022, he has 12 and a half tackles for loss and 7.5 sacks and 78 tackles. So you think, okay, well, this guy, you hope, okay, well, he'll progress a little bit and be even better as a senior. Well, his production fell off to 47 tackles, 10.5 tackles for loss, and 3 sacks on the year. So, I mean, that was just kind of one example of the way things just didn't work out. And so every week we heard like, okay, well, we don't really have the guys to fit what we want to do. And they just never really gelled or meshed and that kind of thing. So what they did is what everybody does in college football. They went and dipped into the transfer portal a little hard to go try to grab guys that fit the system. And some of the things that they did made a lot of sense, right? They brought in J.J. Jean-Louis, a linebacker who was at Iowa State, who was recruited to play that Iowa State system and didn't really immediately pan out there. So he comes down in here. They bring in Jake Shipley from Oregon, a defensive lineman type guy that could, theoretically help them there. And then the thing they really did was they went really hard after rebuilding their secondary, because that was the one big thing they always pointed to was like, okay, if we're going to play this system, we need a bunch of safeties that can come downhill and tackle. And that really wasn't the skill set of the guys that they had. So they go out and they go grab Jaden Hill, a guy from Ohio Dominican, who there was a coaching tie there. He was at a D2 school and was a really good player there and wanted to try to make the jump to the D1 level. They grabbed David Sproles from Northern Arizona, who's coming back to town. They grabbed B.J. Allen, I think he was Texas, as a transfer. And then they also grabbed Asheen Young, who makes a ton of sense. He played in that system at Iowa State and also played it at Ole Miss. And they brought in Xavier Bryce, a cornerback from Texas. So that whole defense just brought a completely necessary influx of transfer talent. And the question is going to be, okay, do these guys all mesh? Do a high enough percentage of them work out to where they'll be significantly better than they were last year? And I think that kind of remains to be seen, but at least you kind of can see on paper, okay, well, this is what they did to address it. And yes, on paper, it does at least make sense.
So you kind of took us through the whole defense. How did all of that stuff look here in the spring and over the course of the practices? If you had to rank, like, okay, the defensive line got the best, and then the linebackers in the secondary, like, I guess how did those jive?
Well, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, North Texas is pretty locked down as far as practice goes. They let you out there for like the first period to see them stretch, and that's about it. And then you get kicked out. So the only thing we saw was the spring game. And so all you can glean from this is what you saw in the spring game, what the coaches say, and what the players say. And, there can be a lot of truth in that sometimes, and then sometimes it's just completely not anywhere close to reality. So you kind of got to judge it based on what your gut feeling is. And just from what they said and from what we saw in the spring, yeah, I think they're going to be better. I think the pieces fit a little bit better. I think the guys maybe believe in the defense a little bit more. Now, does that translate into them being 10 points a game better, 5 points a game better? I'm not sure we're going to know that until the fall, until they actually get out there and see that. Because, I mean, the big thing that they had problems with last year is they were the absolute worst team against the run in the country by like 20 yards. I think they gave up like 255 a game, and the team that ranked the next lowest was like 232. I've got it right here. So yeah, Rush, that's going to be the whole thing. are they not absolutely horrendous on rush defense? Because if you look at it right here, they finished 130 out of 130 with 255.2 yards allowed rushing per game. The team that finished 129 was Louisiana Tech, which allowed 232. And that just says it all. So, I mean, when you're going to have 20 more rushing yards per game than anybody else in the country, you're going to have a heck of a lot of problems. There were games like the one that comes to mind is, they played that really tight game with that key rival UTSA, and UTSA got into like a third and forever situation. They handed it off to Cavori and Barnes, and he ran for like 20 yards and a first down, and that was kind of it. And I'm like, well, that's just the entire season in a nutshell for them defensively.
Talk a little bit about the linebackers. That Jordan Brown returns. Ethan Wesolowski, who was a redshirt freshman last year, had a pretty impressive year. And then, like you said, they brought in JJ John Louis. You think those three guys are the starters? Who do you think is going to be in the middle? Or
well, yeah, I don't think any of this is going to change a whole lot. I think Jordan was their leading tackler last year, and he'll continue to improve. So I think you'll see Jordan Brown and Ethan Wesolowski. And then the other guy they have back is Jalen Smith, who played that other outside linebacker spot. Now, they brought in J.J. Jean Louis, who will also be at one of those outside linebacker spots. I think it's just going to depend on how much that guy, how quickly he adjusts and how quickly he gets up to speed and how much Jalen improves. But I think you're going to probably see that batch of guys there. And then a couple of transfers they brought in last year, Chavez Brown and CJ Garnett, will probably round out your depth chart. At least that's what we've got at this point. But I mean, you may end up seeing the same three guys with JJ kind of sprinkled in there. It's just going to be a matter of whether or not they continue to get better. And I think more than anything, it's going to be about whether or not this defensive line that really only added one key new player can hold up, and if this secondary that they think is going to be dramatically better, especially at the safety spots, are those guys dramatically better? Do Jaden Hill, David Sproles, B.J. Allen, especially Asheem Young, do those batch of guys end up being big-time playmakers that shore up their run defense, or are they going to have the same problems to a certain extent that they did last year?
Is there, talking about that backfield, is there a player that you kind of see? I'm assuming kind of would take over that Patrick Smith role from last year.
Well, I think the lead guy in that secondary, that we've been hearing about this guy since the moment he walked on campus, is Asheem Young. And, that's the guy that they're going to depend on, that everybody talks about. It's saying, okay, this is the guy that, he knows the system. He's a big leader out there. He's got the talent and the size to make this work. And, so I think it's going to he's going to be the guy they look to. I mean, he's 5'10", he's 215 pounds. He started 9 games at Ole Miss. And then he was also he started 24 games for Iowa State, and put up some pretty impressive numbers there. He had 106 tackles in his time at Iowa State. That guy's played at the highest levels, and he's played in the system, and he's played for this defensive coordinator. So they have a lot of belief that this guy is going to come in here and really make a big difference. And I think it's going to depend largely on what that guy does and what the leadership he provides for the rest of that secondary, along with Ridge Tejada, their returning corner, who's been around for a long time, been a good player for them.
Do you think Asheem kind of plays that hybrid role, or is he going to be more like No,
he's going to be the star.
Okay.
He's going to be the star, the center safety in the system. That's exactly what they recruited for him. That's what he played at Iowa State. That's what he's going to play here. So if it all stays like we think it's going to, you're looking at Jaden Hill or David Sproles, the two transfers at the free safety spot. You're looking at BJ Allen or Evan Jackson. It was actually a pretty good freshman for them last year at that boundary safety spot. And then the key spot in the whole system is what they always say is the key spot in the whole system is that star, which is that center, that center safety in there. And they'll have Young in there along with Javen Anderson, who was a pretty impressive freshman last year. He was one of those, like G5 recruits that could have not been a G5 recruit, but, like the coach or like he was one of those really good gets for North Texas. And he had a pretty good freshman year. He had some really good plays, made some mistakes along the way too, just like any freshman does, but he's going to be a good player for them long-term, but he'll be playing behind a Sheen here, theoretically for, 1 year.
So if you had to pick a defensive player to have a breakout here in 2024, who would that be?
Oh, for sure it'd be a Sheen. I mean, that's
okay.
Yeah, I would say, they talked about how when they played the system at Iowa State, the guy who played that star safety spot, that center safety spot, like how many times that guy went on to put up monster numbers and was all Big 12 or all Big 12 second team or, won this honor or that honor or whatever. If they're going to be any good in this system, they're going to need a Sheen to put up, a really good season.
Now that spring practice is over, which position group or groups do you think are the most concerning?
The most concerning? Well, that's a good question. I mean, it's got to be that defensive front, right? Because the thing is with as much scholarship capital that they invested into the secondary, it's hard to see how that they don't see some growth there, right? Because you brought in, I mean, how many proven guys? I mean, you brought in Asheen Young, who's a super proven guy who we've talked about. Xavier Bryce was a really high-end recruit when he went to Texas. Brian Nelson, the other young freshman, he'll be a redshirt freshman this year. Cornerback showed a lot last year. Rich Tejada's a proven guy. They invested so much into that secondary. It's hard to imagine that those guys aren't better. But you look at that front six that struggled at times, to kind of hold up and to play its part in stopping the run. I mean, what did you really add? You added Jake Shipley up front, and you added J.J. Jean-Louis, who might not start in the front six. And that's all you added. Now, granted, you're thinking, okay, well, all these guys get a little bit better because they've been in the weight program another year. They've done this, they've done that. But when you allow 255 rushing yards a game, and granted, they put all the blame on this. They put a large portion of the blame on the secondary for that. But that's the numbers, and they aren't changing. And you're going to go in, and you're not going to add any. You're only going to add maybe one or two. You only added two guys, potential impact guys, to that front six, and neither of the two of them might not start. And you're going to roll that back out there. So you're going to run the same video back again. I mean, that's the thing that you worry about, is that they go out there again and it's maybe the secondary wasn't as big a problem as they thought. And maybe you go back out there again and you're getting, run over again. I mean, that's going to be the thing that if they have a bad season defensively, that would be my thing is like, if they end up having a bad year defensively, it's going to be because that front six, they didn't do enough to upgrade that.
Is there any positions in particular you think they might be looking at in this portal window that opens this week?
Yeah, they've got one spot left, and they want to add potentially a defensive end / defensive lineman for that 3-man front. Now, if you're asking me, they've played this system before, right? In previous years, and when they were most successful with it, they always had a big monster defensive tackle, like a 330-pound guy, right? And those guys are hard to find. They don't end up at G5.
I feel like with a 3-man front, you got to have bodies, right? You got to have beef to kind of eat up the blockers.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, so you're kind of looking at it like, when they ran it before, and this is under a coordinator that was here a couple of coordinators ago, and they had this guy who was, man, I'm going to forget his name because I'm trying to remember it, but he was a guy that he played for Abilene Wiley down here, and he was your prototypical guy to be that 330-pound guy, because he was like a defensive end in high school who was like 280 pounds, but he had a huge frame, and he came in here and he got super big. And then all of a sudden you're looking at it, and he ended up being like a 330-pound guy that could really move. And he wasn't like a kid that was in high school that was 300 pounds, right? He was a guy in high school that was 280 pounds. Those are the guys you want. You want those guys that are 280 pounds and really athletic in high school. And then all of a sudden they get into a college weight program and they can carry 330 pounds and still be super athletic, right? So
hey, Brett, was it Dion Noville?
There you go. Yeah. So Dion Noville was fantastic, and he made it into a training camp with an NFL team, and he didn't quite make it. But I mean, you look up and down the roster here, and they've got Roderick Brown's a good player, but he's 5'11", 300 pounds. And he's their nose tackle. They talk about, okay, well, we want to have athletic defensive lineman. I wonder if they don't look for just one big guy that can maybe anchor the middle, or just maybe another defensive end or somebody with some additional size. But that's where they're going to go. They're going to go try to find a defensive end to plug into this system. And whether they go defensive end or defensive tackle or whatever they're going to decide to do. But that's where they're going to look for somebody. And to me, that would make a heck of a lot of sense, because since you only really have one 300-pound guy that plays, there's one other 300-pound guy on the roster, and that's about it. But I mean, if you look across college football for teams that run a three-man front, it seems like you see a lot more 300-pound guys than what North Texas is rolling out there, even though they want to emphasize speed.
You got to try to. I feel like you have to try to, eat up the blockers, right? Because you can't let those offensive linemen get to your linebackers, or it's bad news for the run defense.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, that's the whole system, and they talked about that last year with Mason, is like his whole role changed to where he was trying to hold the spot and make sure that they filtered the ball carrier to the linebackers and that kind of thing. I mean, that's kind of the system they're playing. And I mean, you can do it with what you've got, but Fata Faye, he's a good player. He's 288 pounds. You got Roderick Brown's 300-pound guy, but Shipley's 255 pounds. But I just wonder if it wouldn't behoove them with this last spot to go out there and find like one big, what's we're looking for, the fire hydrant, stick in the middle there along with Rod, or, another defensive end with size. But I think that's what they're looking for. They said, we're going to look for another defensive lineman. And I just wonder if it's not going to be a big guy. I mean, they may go for another defensive end, but to me, that's the one spot in there that they could really help themselves, is, maybe not, because they've got a few defensive ends. Vic Alawiwe was a good player this last year. They brought in Shipley, who's 255 pounds. He's like more of a defensive end type guy. There's a freshman, Jaden Langley, who's 280. He may grow into that big guy, but it just seems to me like it might be a good idea if they could find one other big run stuffing defensive tackle. They could find one, and if not, just grab another defensive tackle, defensive end type guy.
You can never have too many defense or offensive linemen. So
no, that's the way it is. Yeah.
So we talked about the weakness. What's the biggest strength of North Texas here in 2024?
Well, I mean, it's always with this coaching staff and this philosophy. I think it's definitely going to be, just probably their skill position guys on offense. I think Chandler Morris is he's a proven guy. He's guys like we talked about, throwing for 2,500 yards, 2,400 yards in the Big 12. Kike has been a proven guy. Landon Sides was a good player for them this last year. And you brought in some other skills. Damon Ward, I mean, he's been a really good player for them. Blair Conwright, he's another guy that's got a lot of skins on the wall from what he's done here in elsewhere. So I think just your skill position guys across the board on offense will be pretty good. I don't think that's going to be where they have the problem. And, like we talked about last year, they always seem to have some guy that shows up from somewhere that has the big breakout year, whether that's Landon or whatever. or somebody else. There's going to be a skill guy that comes out in this offense. So I would think, especially with the amount they've invested in, I think wide receiver and running back wise, they'll be pretty good again.
When it comes to recruitment and freshmen and retention of existing players, NIL and transfer portal, those are big things in today's game. What kind of impacts have you seen those things have there at North Texas?
Well, that's the big problem over Texas, right? Because the thing is, and I'm probably right about this over the summer, but North Texas really invested heavily in facilities and upgrading some of those things. They opened that massive indoor practice facility for I think it was $19 million. I think cost. That's one of the nicest indoor practice facilities you're going to find across college football. It's terrific. It's got 100 full length 100 yards plus another 10 yards at the end. It's got an outside portion of another 10 yards of turf outside. And it's right next to the Darrell Dickey practice fields that have been there forever. So they invested a lot in that, and then they renovated the athletic center and things like that. But the thing, I think they really expected that to kind of separate them from a lot of their competition at the Group of 5 level. Well, now kids aren't so much interested in that anymore. They're interested in how much money you're going to give them through NIL. And that's been the big tricky point at North Texas. We wrote about it during last season. Morris talked about we really need more help with NIL and to really ramp everything up. And they've got two collectives. And the interesting part about it is the one was started by a group of boosters who eventually turned it over to a group of Houston businessmen who used to play for Houston. It's called, and they started that collective, and that basically supports the football program. And they chase businesses and various things like that. Well, North Texas has been really successful in basketball. So there's a separate group of boosters that says, you know what, we're really good in basketball. We've been to we went to the NCAA tournament, won a game. We've just won the NIT. We really need to invest in basketball. That's where our opportunity is. So a second collective popped up and is supporting specifically basketball, basically through fans. You got your football one is kind of based on through businesses. Your basketball one is based on fans, and I think they're doing some good things at raising some money, but I'm not sure how competitive they are with some of the other programs out there in terms of raising money and paying players. And they've had that. I think that's the one big stumbling block for them both in basketball and football. I'm just not sure that they've got the cash and the NIL backing collectively to be competitive there. And that's the one big concern. And Coach talked about, we need to really ramp up our NIL group to be able to bring in more players.
Interesting dynamic there when you mentioned basketball. I think you might see that trend, right? Because I feel like you can make a much bigger impact with the money on the basketball, with the limited resource on basketball than you can in football, where one player, one or two players in basketball can mean a whole lot.
Well, and that's the argument that these guys that have started this one that's backing basketball have made is, we can have a much bigger impact in basketball. And unfortunately, they invested a ton of money and now they lost pretty much everybody. The whole basketball team bailed for the portal this last year if they went to the second round of the NIT and lost Seton Hall, which won the whole thing. So they lost, they lost their small forward. He's going on a visit to he was at Memphis over the weekend. Is going to St. John's today, and then they've got they had the best 3-point shooter in the league. He's going on a visit to Memphis later this week. He's in the portal. Their best player is in the portal as well, and he was has been contacted by a bunch of Power 5 programs. So it's just been a problem across the board at North Texas. That the transfer portal this year, because they had more people going to the portal after football season than practically anybody else in the country. And now they're having the same issues in basketball.
And it seems like now head coaches are kind of getting away from the X's and O's and becoming more of this general manager, and they're trying to do some fundraising, and every school is a little bit different. What do you kind of see happening at North Texas from the coaching standpoint? Is it more of a CEO type thing, or is it still actual coaching?
Well, I think it's always, the best coaches out there. I mean, like Nick Saban and people like that were always the CEO type. And I thought it was interesting that Morris talked a little bit about, maybe taking a bit of a step back from the coaching end of it to look at more of the overall program this year. And one thing that, to Morris's credit, like he took less in his contract to really expand North Texas off the field staff. Like they hired in a guy that's essentially a general manager that basically just manages the roster, who's a former Division II coach. They brought in a bunch of extra staff in the recruiting department and various things like that to just help him manage the overall program. So I think, and he does still call plays, but like this spring he didn't. He's like, I'm going to take a step back and look at it more of the big picture and things like that. So I think more and more you're seeing that these coaches are kind of delegating all the coaching aspects of it down to their assistant coaches and things like that. So we're seeing that at North Texas. And the question will be, does that really pay off? And the interesting thing about it too is, one of the powers in Conference USA that also did well this last year, the American, was UTSA. And, that's North Texas' big rival. And Jeff Traylor on one of his Zoom sessions, and somebody forwarded this to me to make a point about it, was like he made a whole big point about how they needed to ramp up their off-the-field staff so that he could be more of a CEO type guy. And they did do that. They had a booster game, I think it was like $1 million or something like that. And they used that to add multiple positions to their staff in terms of their recruiting department and roster management and things like that. So I think you're seeing more of that, just not just in North Texas, but across the group of five. Well, I think that, everything filters down, right? So you saw that at the very, very top of college football. And now it's kind of going down into the group of five, where you're seeing more of these coaches that are becoming more of the CEO type than you did in the past.
When you talked about them adding in that new GM role, do them and the collective talk? Do you know if there's any communication between there? Because I feel like it's hard to manage your roster, and then you've got a different group over here that's giving money to people that maybe you don't know about. How does that dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of new thought and legislation going into that, right? Because when we started out here, it's John Kirkland, senior. He's our general manager and senior offensive assistant. So you're seeing more and more of that kind of thing. Oh, now I got my train of thought back. Because originally when the collectives went in, there was a specific delineation where, schools could not be involved in NIL, right? You remember that?
Yep.
Now you're seeing, there's kind of a movement afoot to where there's a thinking that maybe they want to reverse course on that and allow schools to be involved in NIL. And there's talk about it bringing it in-house. And that,
like they're going to be employees of the university.
College NIL, because that was the whole big thing when you started out, was like, you can't, they wanted it to be totally different, but now there's some thought that maybe that'll change, that they're gonna loosen it and let schools be involved in it. So that's going to be, I think, an interesting story to watch going forward.
Absolutely. Given all the personnel comings and goings from the 2023 team, how would what does success look like at the end of 2024? When you look back at the season, next season, you say, hey, it was Eric Morris' second year, but we did ABC and it was a successful year.
Okay, hang on, I found it. This is from October. College sports leaders are considering making changes to current NIL guidelines that would allow schools to get significantly more involved in helping athletes make money from endorsement deals. So that was the NCAA subcommittee in charge of examining those. So that movement is afoot to let schools be more involved in NIL. So that would be an interesting. Like I said, that's going to be an interesting story to watch going forward. As far as what success looks like for North Texas this next year, If they can get to a bowl game, I think that would be a huge step forward. I mean, that's kind of the thing is Seth Luttrell, everybody was like, oh, he didn't win a bowl. He didn't win a bowl game. He didn't do this and do that. I just wonder if he didn't elevate the level of expectations to a largely unmanageable level at a place like North Texas, because they were in a bowl game every year, and every year they had horrible luck. They drew Troy when Troy had like a fringe NFL quarterback, and they were really good, and they had one of their best teams ever. They got Utah State when Utah State had Jordan Love, and you know how that went. Jordan Love torched them, so they always seem to have horrible luck with bowl stuff. I mean, they should have beaten Miami, Ohio, and would have managed to a home game. But the thing is he always had them in a bowl game, and then just last year it just didn't work out. They lost a few games that kind of cost them the opportunity to get to the postseason. So I mean, if they can get back this year, I think that's the thing they really, really need to do. And it might not be all that easy, but that would be a huge step forward. And man, if they could somehow manage to win a bowl game, that would be the big thing.
And then we've kind of touched on everything here in North Texas, but is there anything else that you would like to share or think that we should know about this North Texas football team?
I don't know. I think we pretty much covered it. Like I said, that's the big question this year. And I think that, you look at their schedule. They've got South Alabama and Stephen F. Austin. The South Alabama game is going to be huge against the old Texas quarterback, Major Applewhite. But they've got Texas Tech and Wyoming will be tough, and then they get into conference play. So that's the big question heading into the years, just whether or not they can get over the hump and make it to a bowl game and potentially, hopefully what they're hoping is that they figure out a way to win one, because they've only won 3 in the entire history of the program.
Well, that does it for us today. Brett, thank you for taking time out of your day to talk a little bit of North Texas football with us.
Yeah, sure, guys.